Hi, you guys. I am making this video to illustrate skill category number two, spatial relationships. But before I do, I wanted to just say something. Um, and I guess I just wanted to say it so you could hear my voice. And I also put a question in it in the Google check-in form. So be honest with me. As always, please be honest. Um, I don't know. I was like feeling kind of bummed out when Pritzker made the decision to close schools for the rest of the school year. I mean, I knew, like most of you, I knew it was coming, but for whatever reason, when he said it, I was like kind of sad because, that means that we really aren't going to have a proper goodbye. Um, so I don't know if you guys are bummed about it too. I just want you to let you know that I'm here and we can chit chat about it. We can definitely talk about it at Zoom. And if you do if you watch this video before Wednesday and you have questions about whatever the rest of the year, so on and so forth, just ask. Okay. All right, so let's get started. Before we move on to the discussion, I just want to give you the perspective again. So last week we did skill category one. This week we're going to do skill category two. Next week I'm going to combine. I might skip next week and do skill category 3 and 4 the following week just together. Kind of works out well actually because I think the political unit is the hardest unit of the five that you have to review. So it'll be nice for you just to focus in on that. And then, of course, skill category 5, scale analysis, will happen the week before your test. So before we get to skill category 2, I want to just highlight some observations from your 4-level analysis because ultimately that 4-level analysis is really designed to help you practice these skills. So just some general observations that I made, and this came from reading all of your 4-level analysis. There was a little bit of confusion about what describe versus explain meant. So I just wanted to highlight what that means. So when you're being asked to describe, you're basically just making observations about what you see. So what are the patterns? And if I saw anything that was like a constant kind of like mistake, it's that you weren't specific enough. So if we're looking at population density, this map right here is population density in China. You should be saying about how this area of China, so the western part of China is not very dense, that all of the density is happening along the sort of like the northern and not northern, I should say more southern and eastern part of China. And then you have varying levels of population density in between. Um, Now, the thing that makes explain different than describe is that once you've described those patterns, then you need to explain them. So you're telling me why those patterns are actually there. And a good rule of thumb, and I'm going to say this over and over again, is that if you are asked to explain something, you better have some kind of a because, right? So this pattern exists, this lack of population density exists because the region is super mountainous, and it's really hard to inhabit. There's not a lot of good agricultural land, etc. Whereas this part of China happens to be really dense because when China was industrializing, this is where most of the industry set up because China served as one of those special economic export processing zones, right? So this is where the job was, this is where the jobs were. So that's why people ended up moving to this area of China. And then you could also go on, because the video also talked about this, that because this became so sort of developed, land became really expensive. And so as Chinese industries were struggling to afford the cost of land, some bid rent in there, they moved inland a little bit more, which is why you see these big pockets of density developed here and here. So think about that as you're thinking about these task verbs: describe and explain. Describe, don't tell me the why, just what do you see? Explain, now tell me the why. Why are those things there? All right. So 2A says describe the patterns, networks, and spatial patterns, networks, and relationships. So just to give, before we give examples of this, let me just again reiterate what these words mean. So describe means to provide a relevant, specific qualities, characteristics, and events. It's more observational. Patterns are networks that reoccur, right? Like anytime you're looking at a map that's not not a resource map. What's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. No, that's okay. Anytime you're looking at like a thematic map, say for example, you're looking for patterns. I mean, that thematic map exists to help you identify or understand whatever characteristic you've just mapped. Networks are those nodes of interaction, right? Think of networks as flows. What are those things that connect us? And then relationships are based on those interactions. And so the more networks there are between places, the better relationship that those places have with one another, the more interconnected they are. So if we're looking for examples for this particular learning target, maybe it's describe characteristics shared by areas having high population density. If I were going to describe that, I would certainly describe it using LDCs versus MDCs. So observationally, how is population density different, say, in LDCs versus MDCs, just to cover my bases, because population density has a bigger impact on LDCs, which so maybe you're going to talk about like shock cities or slums that develop outside of major city centers versus more developed countries where you're just going to see taller skyscrapers to accommodate the needs of the people who are moving to those particular areas, or maybe urban sprawl. Is what would happen in MDCs. Describe how global food distribution is affected by political relationships. Maybe this one sounds a little bit tricky, but it really isn't, because when you think about political relationships, you can think about political relationships between countries and political relationships within countries. So scale matters here. And oftentimes when you are looking at the type of political system, you're going to see more food distribution issues in countries that have a dictatorship slash communist government versus one that is a democracy that's interconnected with the rest of the world. So the Japanese are going to have a much easier time importing food because they're more connected to the global food distribution system than, say, North Korea. And that's a direct result of the government's sort of way of dealing with the international community. And you could also look at it from the lens of, what's happening between countries. So if there's a war, chances are food distribution is going to be an issue within that particular country or between the countries that are impacted by that conflict. Okay, explain spatial relationships in a specified context or region of the world using geographic concepts, processes, models, or theories. Again, explain, you have to tell how or why, right? Use the word because. And then specified context, that's just code for like real world. Like, here's a given example, explain the relationships based on this given example. So, for example, explain why voluntary migration is more common than forced migration in more developed countries. I feel like that's really obvious, right? Voluntary migration is more common because most people are moving for economic reasons rather than to escape for their lives or flee persecution of some kind. And then you would elaborate that on just a little bit more. One rule of thumb with explain that I think would be really helpful and beneficial is that if you have like a really good tangible example, like you could look at migration patterns from Mexico here to the United States and talk about seasonal or migrant workers or something like that. That would be like a really good thing to add to this particular prompt. Explain why contagious diffusion has increased over the past 50 years as a method of diffusion. You would certainly talk about how the world is becoming more and more interconnected because of globalization, time-space compression. Bring in your content knowledge. Explain the correlation between food production and population growth. I mean, I don't know. I would probably approach that through the lens of Malthusian theory or the anti-Malthusian theory. Okay, 2C. Explain a likely outcome in a geographic scenario using geographic concepts, process models, or theories. So I want you to understand that 4-level analysis is really like geared to help you practice these skills. So this is a prediction, and you might notice that in the last 2 4-level analysis that you did, you had to make a prediction based on what was actually happening. So the first week was all about China. Actually, now I'm grading your new one, so I'm like struggling. What was the first? No, the first one was all about the COVID-19 virus and predictions about that, and then last week was all about China, etc. So Explain concerns faced by regions of the world having an aging population. So for this one, you'd have to first identify the concern and then explain why it's a concern, right? So like one of the concerns would be the high dependency ratio, right? So why is that a concern? Because it puts a lot of extra stress and burden on the working age population. And you would do the same with the examples 2 and 3, and I can let you guys can take a look at it and kind of think through it. And if any of these are like, I don't know how to answer this, jot it down and bring it to our Wednesday Zoom meeting, and we can practice with the skills. I like that third one though because it brings in aspects of speeds, and you can probably count on the fact that you're going to see something like number 3 in those FRQs somewhere. Okay, explain the significance of geographic similarities and differences among different locations and or different times. That's a wordy way of asking you just to compare. Compare reasons for geographic phenomenon as it applies to different regions of the world at different times. So explain why superimposed boundaries are more common in Africa than in many other regions. And notice how it doesn't have a compare. Like if you see the compare task verbs, you have to talk about both of whatever it is that you're being asked to compare. With this first one here, it's almost like a compare because you're being asked to think about Africa and you're asked to think about other regions. So in areas like Africa that were heavily colonized or, um, you talk about imperialism, then you would talk about why superimposed boundaries happen there by talking about like why they were created in the first place, right? They were created with very little concern for the people who are living there, unlike many other places, say like the United States and Canada, who like went through the process of creating borders, like definition, delimit, demarcate, administer, all of that kind of stuff. Where Africa didn't really have that luxury because the people weren't considered, so they didn't actually have to stay in their borders. And then you can see that these are, again, a couple of examples. Explain how causes of death as a country, explain how causes of death as a country moves between stages in the, that sounds awkward. I think it just, oh, death changes. That's what I was forgetting. How causes of death change as a country moves between stages in the demographic transition model. So here you're not really comparing like two countries, but you're comparing each stage in the DTM with the ETM. That's it. And then you can read the last one. Okay, the last one is explain the degree. So this is, remember that this is the unicorn point, right? Explain the degree to which a geographic concept, process, model, or theory effectively explains geographic effects in different contexts and regions of the world. So you have to think about whatever it is that you're looking at. Is it minimally effective at explaining whatever it is it's explaining, partially to a great degree? This one's a little bit similar to 1E from last week, explaining the strengths, weaknesses, and limitations. But now you're looking at like how effectively does something explain something else. So von Thunen is a good example. We used it last week too, but von Thunen is a good example for explain the degree because you would talk about how von Thunen is both relevant and not relevant today. I would say Weber would be another really good example, but you're not going to have to use Weber. Like looking at his bulk reducing and bulk gaining model and the idea that like the most important aspect of cost in a product was transportation cost. That's not relevant today, but what is relevant is that even if you want to move overseas, say in Mexico, because you're going to take advantage of cheap labor, which is the most expensive part of creating a product now, you're not going to move to the southern tip of Mexico. You're going to move to the southern border or the northern border of Mexico, because even though transportation is cheaper, you still don't want to go crazy here with moving things farther and farther away. So port city rather than inland, export processing closer to the border rather than further away, etc. Whereas explaining the strengths, weaknesses, and limitations, if we're doing the von Thunen model, like one of the limitations of the von Thunen model is it doesn't consider multiple markets, right? But it's still explained to the degree which is geographic process explain, like theoretically explains where the market is, still kind of makes sense. Like we're not going to get fruits and vegetables from Australia. We're going to get fruits and vegetables from South and Central America because it's closer. So that idea of the rings still relevant, even if the rings are much, much wider, and so on. I think you get the gist. Yeah, and the big difference here is that whereas, oh, actually, I forgot that I put this in here. So, so yeah, 1E is just explain the effects in different contexts and in different regions of the world. So, like, whereas 1E might just be talking about the model, 2E is talking about how the model applies to the real world itself. Okay, so some examples. Explain the degree to which arithmetic density illustrates the carrying capacity of a country. Man, I didn't write that, but I was like, because I got these, I'm beg borrowing and stealing everything I do. But that one tricked me up a little bit because I'm like, I don't think it helps explain the degree at all because you need more information, like how much arable land there is. And unless you have that, arithmetic density is essentially worthless. But maybe I am explaining the degree. Like it could be helpful if you had more information about the country, but without it, not helpful at all. So, how is it helpful? How is it not? Explain the degree to which diets change as a country becomes more economically developed. Well, on the one hand, diet is still very much influenced by culture. And so, on the one hand, culturally speaking, there are certain things that no matter developed or not are still going to be a part of that country's diet. But also that as countries become more economically developed, they tend to eat more meat. And so, you can talk about how culture might, maintain the status quo, whereas more money means that people are going to try and eat more like meat. So again, to the one hand, it's this, and the other hand, it's this. Explain the role of women in agriculture from the perspectives of both the developing world and that of the developed world, right? So like, how do women play a role in agriculture in the developing world, and how is that different than how women play a role in agriculture in the developed world, and so on and so forth. And I think that that is it. So hopefully this helps you understand skill concept number 2. And if you have questions, as always, I'm here to help. So I hope you guys have a good day.